Covering lost civilizational histories. I suppose I had always assumed that historians and people in general looked back on their past and saw roughly accurately how things had developed up to the time they lived. They might not know very much, but they had a rough and roughly accurate picture of the generations that had come down, particularly in literate societies. And learning history, as I did at school and university, I continued in this view that we look out at the world and we see it roughly as it is. With such a view, it's been a big shock in my life to discover in three cases, major cases, that the past is not innocently viewed, that we view it through a set of lenses which shape how we perceive it. And this meant that I've had three enormously exciting adventures, because in these three cases I had a view shared by most of the people in the civilization I was involved with, which made the past a certain shape. And there was no hint that behind that apparent reality was an entirely different world. It was very like fairy stories, where you're just walking along innocently past a wall or past platform 8 and 9, and suddenly you touch something, or you go into a wardrobe, or you go through a mirror, and you enter a parallel world, a parallel universe, which no one else appeared to have noticed. They just walked past. And this has happened to me, as I say, 3 times. And I'll talk about each of these in turn and explain why I think this parallel world was developed and then obscured, and how by accident I stumbled on it. The first of these is in England, English history. I did English history at school and had a rough overview of it. But when I went to university at Oxford in the early 1960s, what I discovered was that there was a widespread and current view that English history was of the following shape. England until about 1500, 1550 was a peasant, feudal, ancient or pre-modern sort of society, where families were dominant, where communities were bounded, where people were stuck in various positions as serfs or whatever. And then in the Great Watershed, as it was called, from about late 15th century through to the late 18th century, England became modern. This was the view propounded by the two great sociologists, Karl Marx and Max Weber, and it was the view which was espoused by the people who were lecturing me, Marxists like Christopher Hill, and those influenced by Marx like Lawrence Stone and Rodney Hilton and Eric Hobsbawm and all the members of a famous periodical called Past and Present. They all painted this before, in between and after picture, and I just swallowed it. It seemed to make sense. So England became different from elsewhere and modern about 300 years ago. It remained in many respects non-modern right to the end of the 18th century. And this applied in all different fields. It was economically embedded in a sort of peasant feudal mode of production until the 16th, 17th century. The political system was antiquated and became modern around the time of Henry VIII through to the English Civil War. The social system was based on big status differences. Women were subservient. It was emotionally undeveloped and backward. Every respect, it was just like any other peasant society around the world. And then suddenly, for some reasons largely unknown, it became modern. Perhaps the Industrial Revolution, perhaps the beginnings of great discoveries and trade and so on, and the Scientific Revolution. I swallowed all this. It seemed self-evidently likely to be the case, and so my heroes like R.H. Tawney in Religion and the Decline of Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, and others. And I even swallowed it to a large extent in the doctorate I did on witchcraft, which was supervised by Keith Thomas, whose great book, Religion and the Decline of Magic, was within that framework, as was my thesis. And so I didn't really have any doubts about it. And the discovery of this parallel magic portal occurred through a set of intersecting factors, and the story is told in the book that reveals this sudden shock, the origins of English individualism, which I wrote in 1977. So it took until I was about 35, 36 for me to question all this. And even as I set out to write that book, I was still thinking in that mode. And it was in the 4 or 5 months of writing the book that I suddenly broke through this ivy-encrusted wall into something totally different. Because what I discovered was that, in fact, there had been no great watershed. There were changes, obviously, large changes, but it was continuity with changes, and that much of the characteristics of modernity in England, as I saw it around me, even in the mid-20th century, were there 500, 600, 700 years back. I took the story back: individualism, market economy, emotional structures, social mobility, all those things I took back and back and back, and there was no break back to roughly 1200 when I stopped. Now, when I explained what I'd found to my history master who taught me at school, he wrote me a lovely letter when he read the book saying, "Alan, I don't understand why you had to write this book, because this is what I was teaching you at school," which he was, because he was part of an earlier vision. But that vision had, without him knowing and me realizing, had been covered over by a whole new school of social, economic, and other historians. And when I analyzed how this had happened, I found that it was a mixture of various things. It was a mixture of this Marxist, socialist ideology through Tawney and others. It was a mixture of medieval studies being taken over by people whose model of what it was likely to be in that time was East European, people with names like Kosminski and Vinogradov and Titov and Homans, all East Europeans who thought, well, if we want to understand medieval England, we look at pre-revolutionary Russia or Poland or other parts of East Europe. And it's like that. So they projected that onto the past. and they were great scholars, and that was all accepted. And so there were a whole lot of different pressures, and having a view that capitalism and the modernity are very recent and accidental productions of the last 200 or 300 years is a good charter for change, because if it's just a recent phenomenon, then we can easily grab hold of it and change it. And this came up in people who were influenced by these historians. For example, Edmund Leach, in his Wreath Lectures, The Runaway World, said, well, our family system is just modern. It was just created in the 18th, 19th centuries. Our social system is just modern. So we can play with it. It's not fixed in any long, continuous history. It's not embedded. It's just a recent trend. So this kind of approach was liberating and exciting. But as I began to look at it now, I can see it led to all sorts of internal contradictions and uneasiness and falsifying of evidence. Just to take one glaring example, if you looked at historians, everything had changed in the 16th, 17th centuries, so modernity was from then. But if you looked at literary sources, if you looked, as I'd been taught, A-levels, Chaucer, or later Shakespeare, they were clearly modern. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales or Shakespeare's plays have modern individuals in them, racked by the same doubts and contradictions and filled with the same mobility and point of view as we do, and that's why we could read them and enjoy them. So how is that? Was this all just fictional, made up by these authors against the real world that was around them? And that was the only sort of solution, and it was taken by one example of this approach, a man called Notestein, a famous American historian of the 17th, 16th, 17th century. And his argument was that people were pre-modern in character in England until about the 19th century. Before that, they had no depth of character. Everything was black and white. People were simple-minded and one-dimensional. And you could see that in the portraits, which showed portraits until the 19th century had no 2 or 3 dimensions. Now, clearly, anyone who looked at the portraits could see this was absolute utter nonsense. But also what to do with Shakespeare, as Notestein said. Well, he said, well, perhaps it was a forgery. Perhaps it was something written in the 19th century with 19th century emotions, and people smuggled it back and started to claim that it had been written in the late 16th century. Well, if you get to that extent of strange convolutions, something is going wrong. And so there was this contradiction and tension, and I think possibly many people felt this, that on the one hand they're told that they're very modern and it's all very recent, and yet their emotions, their intuition tells them that it is wrong. So what happened was that through a set of accidents, just to take 3 of them, one was a smaller one but important. My wife and I collected books, and we used to go to second-hand bookshops, and we found that the books that had been thrown out of the libraries and I was no longer recommended to read were up on the top shelves of these bookshops by the great 19th, early 20th century historians like Stubbs and Maitland and Froude and all sorts of people like this. And so we bought them, and I read them, and they were telling a totally different story before the, as it were, the Marxist invasion. So that was a shock, that things had changed so much even from the 1920s. A second was that my wife Sarah and I did the most detailed study of English documents, primary historical documents of an English village, or two English villages, one in the north of England, one in Essex, from the beginning of them. And in the Essex case, this is the 1380s. And I expected when I was doing this study that they would show this great watershed and change, and the world was different in the 14th century to the 17th century. But I could find no great shift. Obviously there are changes. The monasteries were abolished. There were different patterns of residence and so on. But most of it stayed the same. The legal system remained the same, the political system roughly the system of local government, the manorial system, the ecclesiastical system, weren't changed from the 14th to the 17th, 18th centuries. And this was a huge shock. But we were the only people who, as far as I know, still have ever actually gone through all those primary court cases and manorial documents and transcribed them and put them into a computer database. So the evidence flew in the face of the general theory. And a second thing was that I had started as a historian but changed to being an anthropologist. And as part of my training, I had to go to a pre-modern society. That was required, more or less, then. So I went to a Himalayan village in Nepal and spent 15 months. And I saw what a real pre-modern society was like, how it worked. It was a peasant tribal society where they grew agricultural crops and lived an agricultural life and believed in witches and all sorts of things. So I saw the real thing. And when I came back and looked at the English documents we were beginning to analyse, I saw how very different that world was from the one in England. The amount of geographical and social mobility, the attitudes to money, the attitudes to time, space, everything was totally different. And when I read more about peasantries around the world, I read about Indian and Chinese and Mexican and Polish peasants, I could see that their worldviews and their social systems, their political systems, were totally different from what was revealed by the English documents. So I then looked at other sources. I looked at the comments of observers who came to England, travellers from France and Italy and even Scotland, and they all said, from the 15th century, England is totally different. Fortescue, who went from England to France, Lord Chief Justice, and wrote a book on the English, said the English and the French are totally different in their social structure and their attitudes, even in the 15th century. So I began to realize that what I'd learnt was really a myth. In other words, as anthropologists analyze myths, it was something which told people now something they wanted to believe or needed to believe. One theory of myths in anthropology is that they are charters to explain how we should be and think now. So these were charters or myths. And then recently this has reminded me of a great analyst of this kind of activity, George Orwell, because in 1984 particularly, he explains how political forces generate the past. We make the past to fit what we want to say about the present. In his famous phrase, he who controls the past controls the present. He who controls the present controls the future. So for one reason or another, those who wanted to control the present, maybe improve it or change it or whatever it was, had reshaped the past. Now, with Big Brother, this was a conscious and deliberate policy, and it was a policy which, obviously, Orwell was thinking of the Soviet Union and communism, where this is deliberately done. And I will talk about two other examples where this is more clearly the case in Japan and China in separate talks. In the case of English history, I don't think it was a cynical manipulation. I knew the people who were lecturing and who taught me, and I discussed things with them, and they weren't cynically manipulating the past to justify the present. They really, certain things around them had put pressure on them, which they weren't really aware of, to rewrite history. One pressure, of course, is that if you are a historian of a certain period, and my period that I really loved was this particular so-called watershed period, in other words, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, then you tend to start your history at the beginning of that. So Tawney, for example, knew, as far as I can see, almost nothing about medieval England, and he started with the 16th century, as did many of these other historians. E.P. Thompson knew very little, as far as I can see, before his great period, which is the late 17th and particularly the 18th centuries. And what you do is you make a great shift or change occur in your period from something before, because then you get a backdrop and a significant change. So it's in your interest to make things change rather rapidly just at the beginning of your period to justify your activity. This may be a contributing factor, but whatever it is, what had happened between 1920 and 1950 was that English history, the whole world of medieval Anglo-Saxon and 16th, 17th century history had been reshaped. And I stumbled accidentally in writing The Origins of English Individualism into that lost world. And it was immensely exciting, as you can imagine. It was of the order in history of a real breakthrough in science, a discovery of some new law or theorem. And this was recognized by one of the major proponents of the views I was attacking, because in the first lines of his review of this book, Lawrence Stone wrote in the New York Review of Books, if Macfarlane is right, he is the Einstein of history. In other words, he's made this sort of big breakthrough. Of course, the rest of the review was saying, of course, it's rubbish, he's made it all up and he doesn't know what he's talking about. But if it was right, and I leave others to decide whether I was right, mainly right or not right, but for me it was like Einstein suddenly discovering a secret world and a secret law that explained things which had been puzzling on the edge of my mind. So that's the first parallel world which I've had the enormous great fortune to be able to explore and to explain to other people and to make sense of my own history and life, the identity and nature of my own civilization, and consequently the kind of civilization which was taken to America and has had such a large influence through the British Empire and America on the world. And in the other two talks I will talk about parallel discoveries in relation to Japan and China. Thank you.